If you like dogs, you've come to the right place. Many of us have grown up with dogs or seen dogs on TV like Scooby and Scrappy here. And we like them because they're pretty fun. They're really social. They love to hang out and be cuddly all the time. But do we know why they act like this? Well, now let's take a deeper look. A recent study on science.org takes a look at the structural variants and genes associated with human Williams-Beuren syndrome and underlying stereotypical hypersociability in domestic dogs. Now, this is quite a mouthful, so we're going to take a look at what it actually means here. So we all know that dogs are pretty social animals. They love to be around families and hang out all the time. Now, hypersociability is a facet of domestication syndrome. Domestication syndrome is the hypothesis that animals have changed over time through evolutionary changes in response to domestication of these species. This is usually seen with flopping ears, snout changes, mouth changes, and specifically their behavior changes. So in domestic animals, they become a lot more social and loving to humans as we are the ones who domesticated them. Through domestication, we have been able to create many different breeds of dogs. Many of us have seen these all the time. Chihuahuas, Labradors, German Shepherds, Rottweilers, you name it. You've probably seen it before. The domestication of dogs has created an isolated lineage that we can study and examine. This allows us to compare it to other animals such as wolves and humans, which are outliers when looking at dogs. Common belief is that dogs' personalities are developed by their owners. But contrary to that belief, there is a little bit of genetic linkage to their behavior. The researchers in the study looked at different factors, such as behavior and genetic linkages. To look at the genetics, single nucleotide polymorphisms were examined. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, think back to when you learned biology and learned about nucleotides in DNA. Now, polymorphisms means changes in these little structures. And so we're examining a lot of these. In the study specifically, 48,000 were taken from 701 breeds of dogs and 92 species of gray wolves. Since wolves aren't domestic animals, they had to be trained in a certain way to be able to fit the study. Now, these had to be socialized by humans to eliminate their natural instincts and that what would take over in the study. This way we can eliminate as many variables as possible to determine whether or not it is just genetic linkage for dogs. In humans exists a syndrome called Williams-Beuren syndrome. Now, the symptoms of this are that there are abnormalities in facial development and social development, that being the key part of what is examined here. Those who have the syndrome are known to be very, very social, somewhat like someone who has ADHD, always wanting to be interacting with others and catching their attention. When the DNA sequence for individuals with Williams-Beuren syndrome was sequenced, they noticed a strong structural pattern between all individuals. This is likely the genetic mutation that causes the syndrome. Even though the topic is just on dogs right now, it has a little bit more of an overarching implication in the study. The behavioral genetic studies are still plagued with the challenge to understand the genetic architecture of nearly every facet of a complex behavior. Our study seeks to overcome this obstacle in the canine model, which will allow for further studies in other mammals such as humans and help with psychological development studies as well. The study began with searching the chromosomal region implicated in canine sociability. Now, the researchers noticed that the dogs exhibit traits and structures in their genetic sequence similar to that of individuals diagnosed with Williams-Beuren syndrome. Outside of a genetic standpoint, dogs exhibit some traits that individuals with Williams-Beuren syndrome also exhibit. They're hypersocial, and they lack social cognition and the ability to make decisions based on how other individuals are feeling. You've probably seen this before. Have you ever been upset or sad, and your dog still comes to comfort you? Most individuals might see this and take some caution, but a dog doesn't. It'll come up to you regardless because it lacks the ability to interpret your feelings. The first part of the experiment surrounds itself around non-genetic tests. These are all behavioral experiments to see how dogs compare to other species of wild dogs and wolves. In this portion, 18 dogs were used and 10 wolves were used. The task was centered around the subject being able to go up to a box, determine how to open it, and to open it. Inside they would see some food. Now this was the enticing factor to lure in their interest. To set a baseline, a control was performed. The control consisted of both subjects, wolves and dogs, completing the task without the presence of a human nearby. Now in this segment, wolves and dogs were pretty similar, with the wolves having a slight advantage. In the second trial, a human was introduced to the experiment. Now this individual was not anyone that the dogs or the wolves had known before. He had been randomly selected so that there would be no personal connection that could interfere and create a random variable in the study. First, the wolves were ran. 8 of the 10 wolves were able to complete the task without any distraction from the human. When the dogs were run, only 2 of the 18 dogs were able to complete the task. The other 16 dogs were found to be at the foot of the human, staring, looking at him for attention, even though they did not know the individual. The second experiment consisted of a proximity test. In this, there were 4 stages, 2 for wolves, 2 for dogs, and each there was one with a human that they were familiar to and a human that they were not familiar to. The human was instructed to ignore the animal and look down straight at the ground. The dogs were placed outside of a 1-meter circle. Now the wolves didn't really care in either phase whether or not they wanted to be near the human. They simply observed from where they were placed. And in both trials where there were dogs, they went up to the human and stood by its feet, looking for attention regardless of whether or not they knew the individual. Both these behavioral experiments indicate that there is a psychological connection between dogs and sociability compared to their ancestors, wolves. The next half of this overall experiment was looking at the genes. In this portion, genes associated with the behavior of dogs were examined, and genes associated with Williams-Burnham syndrome were examined. The overall structure had a striking similarity between the two. Then structural variants were annotated. This basically means that they looked at specific pieces of the structures and labeled them. They then took all this numerical data and entered it into a computer. The computer ran 3 different algorithms computing in various ways. The results were astonishing. The computer found a direct linkage between the genes of the dogs that are associated with their behavior and the genes of humans who have Williams-Burnham syndrome. Now, each of these algorithms had examined a behavior model that is present in psychology. These models were then compared to the behavior seen in the experiments run before. This comparison went to show that all structural variants found in the chromosomal regions examined were significantly associated with human-directed social behavior. The final portion of this experiment was PCR analysis. Now, PCR analysis is where we take small pieces of DNA and amplify them. This allows us to run these through gels and have a visual representation of these genetic regions in the form of bars. The structural variants noticed in dogs and individuals who have Williams-Burnham syndrome were not found in wild dogs or wolves, indicating that this trait evolved at the last common ancestor right before dogs. All of this evidence comes to support the fact that the behavior of dogs might be due to their genetic linkage, due to its similarity to individuals who have Williams-Burnham syndrome. Thanks for watching, guys.